The data feed crackled with an urgent, jagged tone that made even the most seasoned archivist flinch. A high-priority notification flashed across a dozen screens in the central processing hub of Matter 6, the beating heart of the Galactic archives. Classification update, humanity, threat level, error, reassessing. Technician Kairos blinked. He'd never seen the word error come from the archive system, let alone for a threat assessment. The machine's algorithms were precise, dissecting every quark of data to determine the relative risk each species posed to the galaxy. But here it was, flashing red, demanding attention. He reached for the communication line, fingers shaking slightly, trying to keep his voice steady. "Supervisor Talon, I think we have a problem." The feed crackled again, this time with a voice, cold, methodical. "State the nature of the anomaly, Kairos." "Sir, it's the human records. The archive can't calculate their threat level. It keeps cycling between parameters, but it can't reach a conclusion." There was a pause, just long enough for Kairos to imagine the supervisor's eyes narrowing. "That's impossible," Talon replied, but even he couldn't keep the uncertainty from creeping into his voice. Kairos swallowed hard. He had a sinking feeling this was beyond just a glitch. Then, a new line of text scrolled across the screens, brighter than the rest, almost like it wanted to be seen. "Threat level reclassified, incalculable. Immediate action required." Kairos could feel the pulse of dread in his chest. The archive never demanded immediate action, never. It analyzed, recommended, and advised. But the word immediate now flickered like a heartbeat, filling the air with tension. Far from the sterile halls of Matter 6, on a backwater planet still trying to find its place among the stars, James O'Connell sat in a makeshift camp, trying to coax a stubborn flame from damp firewood. He wasn't a soldier or a scientist, just a man on a personal mission, chasing stories of strange lights seen in the woods and rumors of a forgotten alien wreck. He had no idea that somewhere out in the vast reaches of space, his entire species had just become the galaxy's worst nightmare. The lights in the processing hub dimmed as Kairos watched the error message scroll for the 5th time, repeating the phrase he now dreaded. Data streams began to pulse erratically across the screens, dumping lines of dense text, encrypted files, and classified historical logs, as if the archive itself was in a frenzy to justify its reclassification of humanity. Supervisor Talon's image flickered on the main screen, his face taut with barely concealed unease. "What exactly triggered this, Kairos?" The last review of Earth-class species showed a low risk of aggression, a predictable cultural trajectory. "How did this happen?" "I don't know, sir. The last report marked them as adaptive but inconsequential. But now the archive's data suggests a potential for violence, technological acceleration, and something else. Something it can't quantify." Talon's frown deepened. "Can't quantify? That's not acceptable. Humans have been stable for centuries. We've had them mapped down to their behavioral deviations." Kairos scanned the lines again, his hand hesitating over the command panel. "It's pulling from recent field reports, cross-referencing them with prior classifications. One of the entries is from a back-channel source. It mentions unexpected adaptations, biological resilience, unconventional problem-solving, and behavioral anomalies. The archive keeps flagging them as deviations." Talon's voice dropped to a growl. "What deviations? You're talking in circles." Kairos sighed, frustration mounting. He isolated the source report, pushing it to the main display. It was raw footage from a surveyor probe that had intercepted a strange signal near the outer colonies. The feed crackled and snapped into focus, grainy footage of a human, thin and bruised, navigating an environment that should have crushed him. The air was thick with toxic spores, the temperature deadly, but he kept moving, kept breathing. The alien observer's voice, translated by the system, murmured over the visuals. "Subject displays an extreme resistance to environmental hazards. Adapted improvised filtration device using local flora, constructed makeshift weapons from wreckage. Subject's capacity for rapid adaptation, beyond projected limits. The footage cut out, replaced by graphs and charts, all marked with the archive's seal of uncertainty. Kairos stared at the data, his mouth dry. This is just one instance, but there are more. Reports of humans surviving environments that should kill them, adapting to alien tech faster than expected, outmaneuvering enemies using methods we didn't predict. Talon leaned forward, his expression now a mask of calculated calm. The archive's algorithms can't process this anomaly, so it declares them a threat. But is that fear, or is it fact? I don't know, sir. But the archive is pushing for intervention. If we don't recalibrate their assessment soon, it'll send out a broadcast to every major council, planetary defense protocols, quarantine measures. Talon's image flickered out. I'll be there in 5 minutes. Do not touch anything until I arrive. As the connection severed, Kairos slumped back in his chair, eyes darting across the screens as they continued to pour out data. Numbers, graphs, projections, all of them struggling to make sense of what had changed. Meanwhile, on Earth's surface, James O'Connell was still struggling with the fire. He cursed under his breath, pulling out a lighter only for the damn thing to sputter out. He glanced at the old compass in his hand, a relic, spinning aimlessly despite the clear skies above. He'd found it near the rumored crash site, where the trees grew twisted, bark charred and blackened. "What's the deal with this place?" he muttered to the forest, as if expecting an answer. It was cold, and the air smelled like burnt metal, tinged with an odd sweetness he couldn't place. James had been chasing strange phenomena his whole life, more out of curiosity than belief, but this place felt different. Like something ancient was buried here, whispering just out of earshot. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise, that sense of being watched. He turned sharply, scanning the shadows between the trees. Nothing, but the feeling lingered. Suddenly, his phone buzzed, a single bar of service in the middle of nowhere. He flipped it open, blinking at the new message, the sender unknown. "Leave now. They know." James laughed, shaking his head. "Nice try, troll." He shoved the phone back in his pocket, dismissing it as a prank. But the shadows seemed to press in closer, and the forest grew quieter, a silence that felt unnatural, heavy. He glanced at the compass again. Still spinning, still useless. But now, he couldn't shake the sense that he'd stumbled into something much bigger than himself. Back in the processing hub, Talon stormed in, his steps echoing in the sterile halls. Kairos stood at attention, but the look in his eyes was enough to stop the reprimand on Talon's lips. He followed Kairos' gaze to the central screen. The archive was now projecting a new analysis, a map of potential outcomes if humans were left unchecked. Each scenario began the same: exploratory contact, peaceful relations, but ended in chaos, the human response veering into unpredictability, resilience, and strategies that defied the archive's logic. At the bottom of the screen, the words blinked like a warning. Anomaly exceeds parameters. Humanity unstable. Advise immediate neutralization. Kairos turned to Talon, voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, the archive has never been this wrong, but if it's right." Talon clenched his fists. "Then we have a decision to make, and if we're too slow, the galaxy might make it for us." James O'Connell stood, pacing a tight circle around his dwindling fire. The message he had dismissed earlier now weighed heavier on his mind, unsettling him in a way he couldn't explain. "Leave now. They know." The words replayed in his head as the forest around him seemed to close in, its silence growing more oppressive. The compass in his hand spun aimlessly, an unyielding reminder that something was very wrong with this place. He wasn't one to spook easily, but every instinct screamed at him to pack up and get the hell out. He had come here chasing stories, strange sightings, bizarre energy readings, and rumors of an ancient crash site buried deep in the woods. Locals whispered about the place in hushed tones, the kind of gossip that would make a good headline, but was usually rooted in nonsense. James had made a career out of chasing the unexplainable, but now he felt like he was the one being hunted. He kicked dirt onto the fire, watching the embers fade before pulling on his jacket. Whatever had sent that message, whether a prank or something worse, he wasn't waiting around to find out. In the processing hub of Mataran 6, the air was thick with tension. Supervisor Talon stood at the center of the data storm, eyes fixed on the spiraling chaos unraveling across the screens. The archive's algorithms had doubled down, continuously running projections and simulations that showed only one outcome: humanity, unchecked, would destabilize the galactic order. "Kairos," Talon said slowly, his voice like a blade through the air. "If these projections continue, every major faction in the galaxy will receive the alert within the next solar cycle. That means panic. That means war." Kairos nodded, hands shaking as he scrolled through the incoming data. "I've tried recalibrating the parameters, but every model shows the same thing. The archive's logic keeps flagging human behavior as anomalous. It can't predict their actions, and that's pushing the algorithms to classify them as incalculable." Talon exhaled sharply. The archive wasn't just some data repository, it was the backbone of galactic peace, an entity that ensured no species posed an existential threat. Its recommendations weren't taken lightly, and now it was demanding immediate action. "I'm not ready to sound the alarm," Talon said. "We need more information before we drag the galaxy into hysteria. We're not dealing with some ancient warlike species, these are humans. A primitive, scattered civilization. How could they possibly be this unpredictable?" Kairos glanced at one of the flagged reports. "Sir, it's not just their military potential. The archive is highlighting psychological factors. Humans are strange. They adapt, improvise, act in ways that don't fit conventional logic." Talon's eyes narrowed. "You mean they're unpredictable because they don't follow the rules?" Kairos nodded. "Exactly. Their creativity, their willingness to do things no other species would consider, it makes them difficult to categorize. One minute they're peaceful diplomats, the next they're leading rebellions with nothing but scrap metal and sheer audacity. The archive can't handle that." Talon slammed his fist onto the console, the sudden movement jarring Kairos out of his nervous daze. Creativity shouldn't be enough to reclassify an entire species as a galactic threat. What's really happening here? But before Kairos could respond, an alert blared across the room. A new data stream flooded the central display, this time a live feed from an orbital surveillance probe. The screen flickered, then focused in on a single human figure, moving through a dense forest. James O'Connell. James moved with a deliberate pace, every step measured as he navigated the uneven ground of the forest floor. He felt watched, by what, he wasn't sure, but the oppressive stillness around him only reinforced that he wasn't alone. His heart pounded in his chest as he trudged deeper into the woods, despite every rational thought screaming at him to turn back. He paused for a moment, catching his breath, and that's when he heard it, an eerie, mechanical hum. Faint, but unmistakable. He scanned the sky, but there was nothing above except the canopy of twisted trees. The sound came again, this time closer, vibrating through the air. Then he saw it. Just beyond a thicket of dense underbrush, a metallic glint caught the last rays of daylight. James crouched low, his instincts telling him that whatever he was about to find was far from normal. He pushed forward, careful to avoid the rustling of leaves. The closer he got, the more his pulse quickened. When he finally reached the source of the reflection, he froze. There, half buried in the earth and partially covered by vegetation, was what looked like a piece of alien wreckage. The metal was unlike anything James had ever seen, its surface marked with intricate patterns, glowing faintly as though it was still powered. He reached out cautiously, brushing dirt away from the object. As his fingers made contact, the hum grew louder, and the patterns on the metal shifted, reacting to his touch. Suddenly, his phone buzzed again. He jerked his hand back, fumbling for the device. Another message, this one more direct. "Leave now. They are coming." James's breath caught in his throat. He glanced around, but the woods were still eerily silent. Who the hell is watching me? His hands trembled as he stuffed the phone back into his pocket, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. But something about the wreckage called to him. Against his better judgment, James knelt down and began digging. On Maturin 6, Talon and Kairos watched the surveillance feed in stunned silence as James interacted with the wreckage. "That ship. It's not from any known species," Kairos whispered. "That design is older than anything in our archives," Talon finished for him. His eyes were locked on the screen, his mind racing. What is a human doing there? And why does the archive consider this site significant? Kairos tapped at his console, pulling up additional data. This area is flagged as a high-interest zone for archaeological research, but it was written off decades ago as barren. Whatever he's found, it's not supposed to be there. Talon leaned forward, watching as James uncovered more of the strange alien metal. "Contact the fleet," he said, his voice hard. "We're going down there ourselves. I need to know what that human has just discovered, and why it's making the archive lose its damn mind." James's fingers worked frantically, pulling dirt and roots away from the buried wreckage. The more he unearthed, the more he realized the scope of what he'd stumbled upon. It wasn't just a piece of alien tech, it was massive, extending further into the ground, its surface shimmering with patterns that seemed to shift like liquid light. The hum grew louder with each passing second, vibrating through the air and setting his teeth on edge. He knew he should have listened to that warning, left this godforsaken place before whatever watched him got closer. But his curiosity overrode fear. There was something ancient here, something powerful, and it felt like it was waking up beneath his hands. He paused to catch his breath, and for the first time, he noticed markings on the surface, symbols that looked like a language, but none that he recognized. They moved subtly, rearranging as if reacting to his presence. As he touched one of the symbols, a jolt shot up his arm, and the hum reached a fever pitch. The air around him warped, bending light as if reality itself was straining to contain whatever he had just activated. James yanked his hand back, stumbling away from the alien wreck, but the damage was done. The ground beneath him trembled, sending shockwaves through the forest, snapping branches and sending birds into a panicked frenzy. The metallic structure began to pulse, emitting waves of energy that rippled through the air. A thought hit him, sharp and cold. What have I just unleashed? Far above the forest, aboard a sleek reconnaissance vessel orbiting the backwater planet, Talon watched the scene unfold on the live feed. He and Kairos had wasted no time getting there, the ship hurtling through hyperspace to reach the planet's orbit in record time. They had overridden the archive's protocols, taking direct control of the surveillance drones, desperate for answers. This can't be possible," Kairos muttered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the ship's engines. "That technology, those symbols, it's pre-galactic era. Why is it reacting to a human?" Talon's eyes never left the screen, watching James with a mix of fascination and horror. Whatever it is, it shouldn't be waking up. The archive's warnings. Maybe they're not about the humans themselves, but about what they could find. As the energy pulses from the wreckage grew stronger, Kairos pulled up data feeds from the archive, his fingers flying over the controls. "We need to contain this, sir. If the energy signatures keep climbing, it could trigger a system-wide alert. The Council will be all over this, and we'll lose any chance of managing the situation ourselves." Talon's jaw clenched. The Council would interpret the incident as a clear and immediate threat, and that meant drastic measures, up to and including planetary sterilization. He wasn't about to let things spiral into that kind of chaos, not without knowing what they were dealing with. "Prepare the containment protocols," Talon ordered. "We'll take him in ourselves. If this human has somehow activated a lost technology, we need to understand how and why." Kairos hesitated. "And if he resists? Then he'll have to be neutralized. But not before we find out what he knows." James staggered back from the wreckage, heart pounding, but the pulsing energy refused to subside. Instead, it began to take form, shimmering lines of light arcing through the air, weaving into a pattern that hung just above the ground. He squinted, trying to make sense of the shapes, when a whisper brushed his mind. Not words exactly, but impressions, fragments of meaning that hit him with the weight of a half-remembered dream. Visions of planets crumbling, stars igniting into blinding novas, civilizations rising and falling in a blink. He stumbled, clutching his head as the images slammed into his mind, one after another. He dropped to his knees, gasping for breath, but the visions kept coming. Then, just as quickly as they started, they stopped. Silence rushed back into the clearing, so sudden it left his ears ringing. The light above the wreckage flickered, then solidified into a strange, hovering object, like a key, but shaped by alien geometries, twisting in and out of existence. He reached out without thinking, and the moment his fingers brushed its surface, a voice, not a thought, but an actual voice, echoed through his mind, deep and ancient, speaking a language that somehow he understood. Wielder, you awaken the forgotten. The cycle begins again. James's breath caught, the words chilling him to his core. What? What are you? He whispered, but the voice did not answer. Instead, the key dissolved into particles of light, flowing into his skin, leaving a faint glow that pulsed with his heartbeat. He stumbled back, horrified at the realization that something had just marked him, chosen him, whatever it was. It had deemed him a wielder of its power, and he didn't have a clue what that meant. His phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a message. It was a call, the number unlisted, the screen flickering, as if the signal was barely holding on. Against his better judgment, he answered. Before he could speak, a voice, rough and urgent, came through the line. If you want to live, you need to run. They're coming for you, James. The line cut off, leaving only static, but the words hung in the air like a death sentence. James shoved the phone into his pocket and turned, scanning the forest for any sign of pursuit. And then he saw them, shadowy figures slipping between the trees, moving with inhuman precision. He ran. Above the planet, Talon watched as their drones captured James's desperate flight through the forest, the energy signatures from the ancient site still spiking. The surveillance feed showed shadowy figures closing in on him, but these weren't just standard operatives. They moved with a fluidity and speed that marked them as something else entirely. Sir, the energy readings are reaching critical levels, Kairos warned, his voice tight with panic. Whatever he activated, it's destabilizing the local atmosphere. Talon gritted his teeth. We need him alive. Those operatives will secure him, but we can't risk a public incident. Prepare for an extraction. As their vessel plunged through the planet's atmosphere, the clouds crackling with residual energy, Talon knew that this was no longer about simple containment. The ancient power James had awoken, whatever it was, had the potential to upend everything the Archive believed about humanity and what they might become. They had to control this situation or risk the entire galaxy being drawn into a chaos beyond their worst projections. James sprinted through the dense forest, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the underbrush tearing at his clothes. His mind raced even faster than his feet, grappling with the inexplicable encounter he'd just experienced, the alien wreckage, the voice, the mysterious key that had somehow fused with him. He could still feel the faint hum beneath his skin, an alien energy thrumming in time with his heartbeat. Behind him, the shadowy figures moved with unnerving silence. He caught glimpses of them through the trees, humanoid shapes cloaked in some kind of stealth tech that bent the light around them. Their footsteps barely touched the ground, their movements eerily synchronized. They were closing in fast. James pushed himself harder, adrenaline surging through his veins. He wasn't sure where he was running to, just that he needed to put as much distance between himself and those things as possible. He vaulted over a fallen log, nearly losing his footing on the slick, moss-covered surface, and crashed through a thicket of ferns. Think, James, think. He had a few tricks up his sleeve, old military training, a knack for slipping away from trouble, but he knew it wouldn't be enough against whatever these things were. His mind kept returning to the message, if you want to live, you need to run. But running only bought him time. He needed a plan. The ground dipped suddenly, and he skidded down a slope, catching a glimpse of a rocky outcrop ahead. He veered toward it, hoping to put some cover between him and his pursuers. As he rounded the corner, he spotted a crevice in the rock face, just large enough to squeeze into. He dove inside, pressing himself against the cool stone, trying to quiet his gasping breaths. The shadows passed above him, silent as wraiths, their shapes blurring as they moved with unnerving precision. James held his breath, straining to catch any sound over the pounding of his pulse. For a moment, he thought they might have missed him. Then, a low, buzzing sound filled the air, followed by a harsh mechanical click. One of the figures paused, turning its head slowly toward his hiding spot. James's heart sank. They know. Talon and Kairos watched the scene unfold from their vantage point aboard the reconnaissance vessel. The screen showed the shadowy operatives converging on James's location, their movements precise, surgical. Talon's hand tightened on the edge of the console, his expression grim. "Damn it," Talon muttered under his breath. "He's cornered." Kairos glanced at him, sweat beading on his brow. "We could intervene directly, sir. Take control of the operatives remotely." "No." Talon's jaw clenched. "If we step in now, we'll expose our presence to the archive. We need to see how this plays out. Besides, if he's managed to survive this long, he might have a few surprises left." Kairos hesitated, then nodded, turning his attention back to the feed. But something about the operatives' behavior nagged at him. They weren't standard recon units, too precise, too coordinated, and the archive hadn't flagged them as any known species. He leaned closer to the display, zooming in on one of the figures. Then he froze. "Sir, look at this," Kairos said, his voice barely above a whisper. He pointed to the screen, where the operatives' outlines shimmered, their forms glitching in and out of view. "Their tech, it's not just cloaking. It's phasing in and out of our reality." Talon's eyes narrowed. "They're not from here, are they?" Kairos shook his head. "No, and they're not working for us, either. Someone, or something, else is monitoring this situation, using technology even the archive can't trace." Talon felt a chill creep through him. If there were other players involved, then their mission had just become infinitely more dangerous, and the stakes had risen beyond a simple containment operation. "Keep monitoring them," Talon said, his voice hard, "and prepare the extraction team. If those things make a move on him, we'll have to intervene, archive protocols be damned." James pressed himself tighter against the cold stone as the operative's masked face tilted toward his hiding place. He could hear the faint hum of their tech, a frequency that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. His mind raced, trying to think of a way out. Then, a strange warmth spread through his chest. The alien energy he'd absorbed flared, the glow beneath his skin intensifying. He could feel it coursing through him, strange patterns forming in his mind, shapes, runes, symbols that twisted into meaning he couldn't quite grasp. "Use it." The thought came unbidden, but it felt right. He focused on the hum in his chest, willing the energy to respond. His hand burned with a sudden heat, and when he looked down, he saw the same alien symbols that had been etched into the wreckage, glowing faintly across his skin. He didn't know what he was doing, only that he needed to do something. He pushed outward with his mind, feeling the energy surge through him, and suddenly the air around him warped. Light bent, reality twisting just as he had seen it do around the alien key. The operative froze mid-step, its head tilting as if trying to track something just beyond its perception. James held his breath, praying that whatever he was doing was working. And then, to his shock, the figure turned away, its form flickering before it moved on, slipping back into the shadows. James stayed perfectly still, even as his heart hammered in his chest, barely believing his own luck. After a few tense minutes, the figures vanished into the forest, their presence fading like a bad dream. He exhaled, the glow in his chest dimming, leaving him drained and shaken. He didn't know how long the strange energy would last, but it had bought him time. But he couldn't shake the realization that whatever he had tapped into was more than just technology. It was something alive, something ancient, and it had reacted to him in a way he couldn't yet understand. Talon slammed a fist onto the console, frustration flashing across his features. He did something, masked his presence from those operatives. Kairos, what the hell just happened? Kairos's fingers flew over the controls, analyzing the data from the scene. I think he's using the energy from the artifact. It's interacting with the local reality field, manipulating it somehow. Talon stared at the data readout, realization dawning. The archive classified humanity as incalculable because of this. Their potential to adapt and harness powers they don't even understand. If he's managed to bond with that ancient tech. He trailed off, the implications clear. If a single human could interface with such an artifact, what would happen if more of them stumbled onto this power? It wasn't just a matter of controlling one rogue element anymore. This could change the balance of power across the entire galaxy. And someone else was already aware of it, playing a game they didn't yet understand. Talon turned to Kairos, his expression hardening. Double our security. I want to know who those operatives are working for, and I want to know it yesterday, and bring us into low orbit. If he makes another move, we need to be ready to extract him, or end this, if it comes to that. Kairos nodded, his face pale. He could sense the gravity of the situation shifting, spiraling towards something they might not be able to control. As the ship descended toward the planet's surface, Talon couldn't shake the sense that they were standing on the edge of a precipice. The archive's dire projections, the ancient technology, the unknown players in the shadows, it all pointed to one terrifying truth. They were no longer in control of this game. James's mind buzzed with questions as he pushed through the underbrush, his body running on pure adrenaline. His thoughts kept circling back to the strange, alien key that had merged with him. He couldn't quite grasp how he had repelled those shadowy figures, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever he had triggered was beyond anything he'd encountered before. It had saved his life, but it had also painted a target on his back. He slowed as he reached a small clearing, his breaths coming in harsh gasps, and risked a glance over his shoulder. The shadows were gone, but he knew they wouldn't give up that easily. He needed to find shelter, somewhere to regroup and figure out his next move. A memory surfaced, an old cabin nestled deep in the woods, a remnant from his father's hunting trips long ago. It was off any known trail, forgotten by most. If he could reach it, maybe he'd have a chance to catch his breath and make sense of what had just happened. He set off again, this time moving with more purpose, each step taking him deeper into the dark embrace of the forest. Above the planet, Talon and Kairos monitored the scene, their ship now hidden behind a veil of atmospheric interference, skimming the treetops. The tension in the control room was palpable, the quiet hum of the machinery amplifying every flicker on their screens. His energy signature is stabilizing, Kairos reported, watching the readouts with a furrowed brow. He's heading toward a structure about a mile out, a cabin. Looks abandoned. Talon studied the data, noting the fluctuations in the energy field surrounding James. The artifact's power seemed to be adapting to him, integrating with his biology. If they didn't intervene soon, the human might become an even bigger threat, one that no containment protocol could account for. But more concerning were the shadowy figures that had appeared and then disappeared without a trace. Kairos analyzed the footage of those operatives again. I want to know where they came from and what tech they're using. Kairos nodded and began to run the analysis, but he paused, a new signal catching his attention. His fingers flew over the console, bringing up a distorted transmission. The audio crackled with static, as if the message was struggling to break through an immense interference field. It's not from our network, Kairos said, his voice tinged with confusion. It's coming from. No, it's echoing through the ancient energy readings, like a signal piggybacking on the artifact's frequency. Talon's eyes snapped to the display. Play it. The speakers crackled, and a voice, warped and fragmented, filled the air. It was unlike anything they had heard, layered, almost melodic, with a tone that resonated in their bones. Words tumbled out, half understood, in a language that seemed to slip between the edges of their comprehension. Wielder, awakened. The cycle resumes. The transmission cut off as abruptly as it had begun, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. Talon exchanged a look with Kairos, a chill running through him. Whoever or whatever had sent that message, it wasn't broadcasting on any known communication network. It was speaking directly through the artifact's energy field. Could it be an AI remnant from the pre-Galactic era? Kairos ventured, the words barely a whisper. Or something older, Talon replied grimly. Something that was never meant to be found. James reached the cabin just as the last light of dusk faded from the sky. He slipped through the creaking door, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The interior was dusty, filled with the musty scent of decaying wood, but it was secluded enough to give him a moment's respite. He slumped down against the wall, every muscle in his body aching, and tried to focus on the strange energy pulsing beneath his skin. His mind drifted back to the words he had heard earlier, the voice that had called him a wielder. He didn't know what it meant, but it had spoken as if he had been chosen for something, as if he had a role to play in whatever ancient cycle had been set into motion. He pulled out his phone again, thumbing through the scattered messages and calls, hoping for a clue. But the screen remained blank, no messages, no missed calls, as if the voice he had heard had erased all trace of its warning. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration building. How was he supposed to figure out what to do when nothing made sense? He focused on the key-shaped glow that still lingered beneath his skin. He closed his eyes, trying to concentrate on the hum, on the strange symbols that had appeared in his mind earlier. For a moment, he thought he felt something, like a thread stretching out into the darkness, a connection to something vast and unknowable. But it slipped away before he could grasp it, leaving only a dull ache in his chest. Damn it, come on, he thought, clenching his fists. There's got to be a way to control this. He opened his eyes and nearly screamed. A figure stood across the room, its outline blurry and indistinct, as if it was being projected from some other reality. It flickered in and out of focus, but its eyes, cold and silver, locked onto his with a predatory intensity. You should not have touched the relic, wielder, the figure hissed, its voice like the scrape of metal on stone. You've awakened forces beyond your comprehension. James scrambled to his feet, backing away toward the door. Who are you? What do you want from me? The figure's form rippled, as if struggling to maintain its presence in this world. Your kind always ask the wrong questions. It is not what I want, it is what they demand. The cycle cannot be disrupted. Before James could react, the figure lunged forward, moving faster than his eyes could track. But just as its hand shot out toward him, the glow in his chest flared, a shockwave of energy erupting from his body. The figure was thrown back, slamming into the far wall, its outline distorting as if reality itself was rejecting it. It snarled, its form flickering with a cascade of broken symbols, before it vanished, leaving only a thin wisp of smoke behind. James collapsed to his knees, gasping for air, the remnants of the energy coursing through him. He stared at the spot where the figure had been, his mind reeling. Whatever had just attacked him, it wasn't entirely real, at least not in the way he understood reality. It had been caught between worlds, like the key itself. But it had known about the relic, and it had called him a wielder, just like the voice from the wreckage. This is too big, too dangerous, he thought, dread settling in his gut. I need to get out of here. I need answers. He stumbled to his feet, gripping the edge of the table to steady himself. But before he could take another step, his phone buzzed with another message, this time a simple text, but one that froze the blood in his veins. It read, "We are closer than you think. Run, and you'll only hasten their arrival." James stared at the screen, the cabin suddenly feeling much colder, much darker. He had no idea who, or what, had sent the message, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't alone out here, and whatever shadows hunted him, they were playing a game he didn't understand. James's hand shook as he clutched his phone, the message glaring back at him in the darkness. The cabin creaked under the pressure of the wind, but every sound felt amplified, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. He stuffed the phone into his pocket, forcing himself to think through the haze of fear clouding his mind. He had come here to regroup, to get a sense of what he was dealing with. But the rules kept changing, the danger escalating. He moved toward the cabin's small, dust-caked window, careful to keep low. Peering out, he scanned the tree line, half expecting to see the shadowy figures re-emerge from the woods. But there was nothing, only the quiet rustling of leaves under the pale light of the moon. "We are closer than you think." The words echoed in his mind, refusing to let him rest. Whoever had sent the message wasn't bluffing. They had to know about the figures, about the energy that had surged through him. But what was their end game? Were they trying to help him? Or were they just another piece on a chessboard he couldn't see? He needed answers, and he needed to survive long enough to find them. James turned back toward the dusty interior, scanning the room for anything he could use. The cabin held remnants of another life, his father's old hunting gear, a rusted toolbox, stacks of waterlogged magazines. His eyes fell on a weathered hunting rifle mounted on the wall, its barrel lined with patches of rust, but still serviceable. He took it down, testing the weight. It wasn't much against whatever alien tech those shadowy figures had, but it was better than nothing. He grabbed a box of shells from a nearby drawer and loaded the rifle, the familiar clicks giving him a brief sense of control. But just as he turned back toward the window, a sharp sound split the air, a crackling buzz, like static building to a shriek. The walls of the cabin shuddered, and for a moment the air seemed to warp, bending inward as if the fabric of reality was twisting around him. James stumbled back, clutching the rifle tighter. His breath hitched as he realized the sound was coming from inside his head, resonating with the strange hum of the alien energy in his chest. He clamped his hands over his ears, but the noise only grew louder, more insistent, until it stopped. The air grew still again, but something had changed. James's skin prickled with an unfamiliar sensation, a tingling that spread from the center of his chest outward. And then he heard it, a voice, faint and barely more than a whisper, but distinctly not his own. The chains break. The key turns. "Wielder, you are chosen." James froze, his eyes darting around the room, but there was no one else there. He tried to focus on the voice, straining to understand its fractured words. "Who are you?" he whispered, unsure if he was speaking to the air or to whatever had taken root inside him. "What do you want from me?" The voice seemed to ripple, as if it was struggling to translate its meaning into something his mind could comprehend. Not what, but when. The cycle turns. The shadow's hand extends. They come. Before James could ask anything more, the air pulsed with a cold wave, and the voice faded, leaving behind a hollow, aching silence. He leaned heavily against the wall, trying to steady his racing thoughts. The cryptic warnings made no sense, but they carried an urgency that gnawed at him. He felt a new vibration then, his phone again. He fished it out, half dreading what he might find. This time, it wasn't a message, but an incoming call. The number was masked, the screen flashing an unfamiliar icon, one that matched the alien runes he'd seen beneath his skin. His finger hovered over the answer button, his mind screaming at him to leave it alone. But some part of him, driven by desperation, made the choice. He swiped to answer, and a familiar voice crackled through the line. "You have very little time, James." The voice was clipped, urgent. He recognized it. It was the same one that had warned him to run back at the wreckage. "They're locking onto your location. I'm sending a bypass frequency, but it won't hold for long." "Who are you?" James demanded, gripping the phone tightly. "What the hell is going on?" There was a brief pause, as if the voice on the other end was weighing how much to reveal. "You're in possession of a relic, one that the Archive and their enemies would kill to control. The power it holds is ancient, dangerous, and it's tied to you now. They won't stop until they have it, or until you're dead." James glanced down at the faint glow beneath his skin, the strange warmth that had become a constant presence. "What do you mean, tied to me? Why me?" "You were compatible. The energy it holds, it's alive, in a sense. It chose you, just as it has chosen others before. But that's not important right now. You need to get out of the cabin. The line crackled with interference, a harsh buzz drowning out the voice. James pressed the phone harder against his ear. Wait, chosen for what? Who's after me? Trust no one. The archive. Not the only interested party. The voice faded, the distortion warping the words until they dissolved into static. Then, another voice cut through the interference, low, guttural, and unmistakably alien. It sent a chill down James's spine, the words grinding like ancient stones. Wielder of the key, surrender, and we may grant you mercy. James's grip tightened on the rifle. His mind flashed back to the shadowy figures, to the flickering being that had attacked him earlier. This voice was different, more direct, more certain in its menace. He didn't wait to hear what else it had to say. He hung up and stuffed the phone into his pocket, swinging the rifle over his shoulder. He grabbed a flashlight from the shelf, but the beam flickered wildly, barely holding a steady light. As he made for the door, the air in the cabin grew colder, thick with an unspoken threat. He pushed the door open, stepping out into the night, and froze. The forest that had once felt so familiar now seemed twisted, shadows lengthening in unnatural directions. The ground underfoot felt less solid, as if reality itself was loosening around him. And in the distance, among the trees, he saw a flickering light, like a lantern held by a figure that shifted and blurred, moving closer with every heartbeat. James turned and ran, the cabin shrinking behind him, his breath fogging in the frigid air. He plunged back into the woods, branches whipping against his face, his boots slipping on the damp earth. But no matter how fast he ran, he could feel the presence closing in, the whispering shadows pressing against the edges of his vision. He stumbled through the underbrush, his flashlight swinging wildly. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a path, a trail that shouldn't have been there, glowing faintly with the same alien runes that had marked the key. He didn't know if it was a trap or a lifeline, but he veered toward it, desperation driving him forward. Behind him, the air seemed to shudder, a deep, resonant hum filling the night. He glanced back, and his blood turned to ice. The shadowy figures were no longer hidden. They emerged from the darkness, their forms twisting in impossible ways, their movements like a film played in reverse, and at the center of them stood a new figure, taller and more solid than the rest, its face hidden beneath a hooded cowl that shimmered like black glass. The figure raised a hand, and the air around James buckled. A wave of force slammed into him, knocking the breath from his lungs, sending him sprawling to the ground. The rifle skidded out of his grip, lost among the fallen leaves. "You cannot run, wielder," the hooded figure intoned, its voice a chorus of layered echoes. "The key is ours." James struggled to push himself up, his head swimming from the impact. The air crackled with energy, the pressure building like a storm ready to break. He felt the alien warmth flare in his chest again, a desperate pulse that matched his own racing heartbeat. "I have to fight back." The thought came through the haze, sharp and clear. He reached inside, willing the energy to respond, to do something. And this time, it answered. The ground beneath him rippled, symbols flaring to life around his hands, the same markings he had seen in the wreckage. A barrier of light snapped into place, crackling between him and the advancing figures. They recoiled, their forms blurring with static, as if the field was scrambling their presence in this reality. For a moment, James dared to hope that he could hold them back. But then the hooded figure stepped forward, raising its hand again, and the barrier began to crack under the pressure. James gritted his teeth, pouring every ounce of willpower into maintaining the shield. He didn't know how long he could hold it, but he knew one thing for sure. He was no longer just running. He was standing between them and whatever they wanted from the key, and he wasn't about to give up without a fight. James gritted his teeth as the barrier began to crack under the force of the hooded figure's assault. The energy field buckled, sparks flying off in all directions, each crack spreading like a spiderweb through the glowing runes. Sweat dripped down his brow, his arms trembling with the strain. He could feel the pressure building against his chest, as if the key inside him was struggling to match the alien force pressing in. Hold, hold, he muttered under his breath, even as he sensed the shield buckling. The hooded figure's silhouette blurred, shifting in and out of focus, as if its very presence was warping the space around it. James felt a surge of frustration. He didn't understand this power, didn't know how to control it, and the feeling of being outmatched gnawed at him. Then, just as the barrier shattered, an unexpected jolt shot through him, a spark that felt like a knife through his mind. It wasn't pain, exactly, but a sense of something unlocking, a hidden compartment in his thoughts flaring open. Focus, the thought whispered through him, clear and alien in its precision. See beyond the veil. James's vision wavered, the world around him splitting into layers of shifting light and shadow. The hooded figure's form peeled apart like a mirage, revealing a latticework of energy threads that wove through the air, linking it to the other shadowy figures and, impossibly, to the glowing runes under his own skin. He reached out, barely knowing what he was doing, and grasped one of the threads. The energy surged through him, a wild, chaotic torrent that threatened to pull him under. But as he focused, it began to bend, reshaping itself under his will. With a shout, he twisted the thread, sending a ripple through the air. The pulse of energy expanded outward, slamming into the hooded figure and its companions. They recoiled as if struck, their forms flickering wildly. The pressure against him eased, and for a brief moment, the air around the clearing grew still. James stumbled back, his legs shaking with the effort. He felt like he had just sprinted a marathon, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But the hooded figure remained standing, even as the other shadows began to dissolve, melting back into the darkness of the forest. The figure's cowl shifted, revealing a glimpse of a face, angular and sharp, eyes glowing with an unnatural blue light. Its expression was unreadable, alien, but there was something new in its gaze, something that twisted James's stomach with a sense of foreboding. Impressive, wielder, the figure intoned, its voice reverberating through the night air. But you are meddling with forces you cannot hope to master. The key is not yours to control. Surrender it, and perhaps your suffering will end swiftly. James tightened his grip on the rifle, though he knew it would be useless against whatever this thing was. No deal? You want the key? You'll have to come through me. The figure's lips curled into something like a smile, though there was no warmth in it, only a cold amusement. So be it. When you fall, your kind will learn what it means to defy the ancient order. Before James could respond, the figure faded, its form dissolving into a swirl of shadows that dissipated into the night. The pressure in the air lifted, and for the first time since the encounter began, the clearing felt empty, eerily so. James sank to his knees, the adrenaline finally draining from his system. He let the rifle fall to his side, his mind spinning. The echoes of the strange power still pulsed beneath his skin, but he felt like he'd narrowly avoided being consumed by it. He had driven the figure back, but he knew it was only a matter of time before they returned, stronger, and with reinforcements. He needed to figure out what he was dealing with, and fast. His hand drifted to the phone in his pocket, but before he could retrieve it, a soft rustling caught his ear. He froze, every nerve on edge. Then, from the shadows, a figure stepped into the clearing, this one human, or close enough. It was a woman, her features obscured by a hood, but her stance was wary, her hands visible at her sides. She made no move to attack, but there was a tension in her posture that spoke of readiness. "You really don't know what you've gotten yourself into, do you?" she said, her voice carrying a note of dry amusement. Flinging around ancient energies like a child playing with a loaded gun. James blinked, the unexpectedness of her appearance throwing him off balance. "Who the hell are you?" She pulled back her hood, revealing sharp, calculating eyes and a cascade of dark hair. "Name's Leora. Let's just say I'm one of the few people on this rock who isn't looking to dissect you or take that key for themselves. But we don't have time for a long chat. Those shadows you just tangled with, they're the least of your problems." James eyed her warily, but there was something in her expression, a kind of urgency that matched his own sense of desperation. "Why should I trust you?" Leora let out a humorless laugh, glancing around at the lingering ripples of energy in the air. "You don't have to trust me, but you want to survive the next 24 hours. Then you'll follow me. Unless you'd rather stick around and see how many more of those things the archive sends your way." James hesitated, his mind racing. He had no reason to believe this stranger wasn't leading him into another trap. But the encounter with the hooded figure had shattered whatever illusion of safety he might have had. He couldn't fight this war alone, not when he barely understood the rules. "All right," he said, keeping his tone guarded. "Lead the way. But you try anything, and I'll make sure you regret it." Leora gave him a sharp nod, a flicker of acknowledgement in her eyes. "Fair enough, Wielder, but let's move fast. The archive's eyes are everywhere, and if we're lucky, we might just stay one step ahead of them." With that, she turned and disappeared into the trees, moving with the sure-footed grace of someone who knew these woods well. James followed, casting one last glance back at the cabin, its shadows stretching like long fingers into the night. He couldn't shake the feeling that with each step he took, he was walking deeper into a labyrinth of secrets, where the walls were shifting and the exits kept slipping further away. But he couldn't turn back now. Not when the shadows were closing in from all sides, and the key inside him hummed with a purpose he was only beginning to understand. James moved through the dense underbrush, trying to keep pace with Leora as she navigated the shadowed forest with unsettling ease. She seemed to blend into the darkness, her movements almost soundless, while he stumbled over roots and branches, every crackle of dried leaves beneath his boots sending his nerves flaring. His mind buzzed with questions, but the urgency in Leora's stride kept him silent. The encounter with the hooded figure still lingered in his thoughts, replaying in fragments the way its presence had warped reality, the cryptic threats about the key, and now this stranger appeared, offering answers with a vague promise of survival. But at what cost? They moved through the trees until they reached a rocky ridge overlooking a clearing, the moonlight casting long shadows over the landscape. Leora paused, scanning the area before motioning for him to crouch beside her. "There's a path ahead," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the tree line. "We follow it, and we'll reach a safe house before dawn. But there's something you need to understand before we get there, something about that thing inside you." James tensed, the glow beneath his skin flaring subtly at the mention. "You know about the key?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "What is it? Why is the archive after me?" Leora shot him a sidelong glance, her expression unreadable. "It's not just the archive. There's more than one faction interested in what you've got, and none of them have your best interest in mind. That thing you're carrying, it's a remnant, a relic from a time before any of our histories. You weren't supposed to find it, but now that you have, you're a target." James swallowed, the implications sinking in. "A target for what? And what does it want from me?" She hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. "The key isn't just a source of power, it's a link to other realms, to other realities. The kind that overlap with ours, just out of sight, where things don't play by the rules we know. It's ancient tech, but it's more than that, it's alive, in a way. It's chosen you as a conduit, and that means you're caught in the crossfire of a war that most of this world doesn't even know is being fought." James's mind reeled at the revelation. A part of him wanted to dismiss her words as some elaborate trick, but he couldn't deny what he'd experienced. The visions, the power surging through him, the figures that seemed to twist the world around them. "And what do you get out of this?" he asked, his tone hardening. "Why help me?" Leora sighed, glancing away toward the distant line of trees. For the first time, her guarded demeanor seemed to crack. "I have my own reasons, but let's just say I know what it's like to be hunted. And if I'm right, you have a chance to change the game, not just for you, but for a lot of people." James studied her, trying to read the truth behind her words. But before he could press further, a faint hum cut through the air, a low, rhythmic vibration that sent a chill crawling down his spine. Leora stiffened, her hand dropping to the hilt of a concealed blade at her waist. "We've been followed," she hissed, scanning the darkness. "Stay low. If they find us here, we're as good as dead." James dropped into a crouch beside her, clutching the rifle. He strained his ears, catching the subtle shifts in the air, the distant rustle of movement through the trees. His chest tightened, the hum beneath his skin growing sharper in response, as if it was resonating with the unseen threat. Leora motioned for him to follow her down the slope, using the ridge for cover. They slipped through the underbrush, each step calculated to avoid making noise. But the humming continued to grow louder, a metallic drone that seemed to reverberate through the air itself. Just as they reached a cluster of fallen logs, a shape loomed through the darkness, tall and angular, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. James's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the flickering, almost digital outline of one of the shadowy figures. But this one was different, its form more defined, its movements smoother, as if it had shed whatever disguise it had used before. Leora tensed beside him, her grip on the blade tightening. "That's a recon scout," she muttered under her breath. "It's not here to engage, it's here to track. If it locks onto your energy signature, it'll broadcast our position to every hunter within range." James glanced down at the faint glow under his skin, realizing with a jolt that he might be the beacon it was drawn to. He gritted his teeth, willing the energy to subside, but it continued to pulse in time with the humming. "Can we take it out before it signals?" he asked, his voice barely more than a breath. Leora shook her head. "Not quietly, and if we spook it, it'll call for backup faster than we can run." She met his gaze, a decision hardening in her eyes. "There's a clearing up ahead. I'll try to draw it away, give you a chance to reach the safe house. But if I don't make it back—" "No," James cut her off, surprising himself with the force of his refusal. "We stick together. I'm not running blind into whatever's waiting for us. If you've got a plan, tell me. Otherwise, I'll take my chances here." Leora blinked, caught off guard by his defiance. But then she nodded, a grim smile tugging at her lips. "All right, then. We'll do this your way. But if it goes south, you'd better be ready to improvise." She reached into her jacket, pulling out a small device, a disc-like object lined with unfamiliar symbols. She pressed it into his hand. "This is a dampener. It'll mask your signal for a few minutes if you activate it. But it's a one-time use, and the moment it wears off, you'll be visible again." James took the device, feeling the weight of the choice pressing down on him. The humming in the air grew sharper, a buzzing that seemed to throb in his ears, and the recon scout's form began to shift, as if sensing their presence. He glanced at Leora, then back at the shadowy figure. "On 3, he whispered, holding the dampener tight. "You distract it. I'll use this to make a break for it. If we're lucky, we can regroup before it calls in reinforcements." Leora nodded, her expression steeled. 3, she murmured, her hand flexing around her blade. 2, 1. She moved like a shadow, darting from their cover with a sudden burst of speed. The recon scout reacted instantly, its form rippling as it turned toward the movement, its limbs extending like metallic tendrils. Leora slashed at its torso, the blade cutting through its flickering form with a burst of sparks. But the figure barely faltered, its focus zeroing in on her. James took the chance, jamming the dampener against his chest and pressing the activation switch. A low hum vibrated through his body, the glow beneath his skin dimming as the device enveloped him in a field of cloaking energy. He slipped away from the logs, moving through the trees toward the path Leora had mentioned. He glanced back just in time to see the scout lash out, a tendril catching Leora's shoulder and sending her sprawling. But she twisted with the blow, slashing at its limb even as she fell, her movements quick and precise. She was buying him time, risking everything on the hope that he would reach safety. His heart pounded as he moved faster, the dampener's hum beginning to fade. The forest seemed to stretch around him, shadows warping and shifting as if the landscape itself was bending to some unseen will. He stumbled into the clearing Leora had described, a small hollow surrounded by ancient oaks. But the sense of safety was fleeting. As the dampener's field dissolved, the alien energy inside him flared back to life, sending a sharp pulse through the air. He sensed the presence of other watchers in the distance, more of the shadowy figures closing in like a tightening noose. James raised the rifle, his hands shaking with adrenaline. He knew he was outmatched, that this might be a fight he couldn't win. But he had come too far to give up now, not with the key burning inside him like a promise yet unfulfilled. He took a deep breath, bracing for the next wave of shadows. And somewhere, in the back of his mind, he felt the key stir, its energy thrumming with a new, dangerous potential, one that whispered of risks and power he couldn't yet comprehend. James steadied his breath as he faced the encroaching shadows. The clearing felt like a cage, the towering trees casting long, oppressive shadows that closed in around him. The key pulsed with energy beneath his skin, a rhythmic thrum that matched the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had no idea how he would fight off the shadows closing in, but he was determined to hold his ground. A flicker of movement caught his eye. Leora burst into the clearing, her face a mask of resolve and desperation. She was bleeding from a gash on her arm, but her eyes burned with fierce determination as she scanned their surroundings. "Get ready," she shouted, her voice cutting through the tension. "They'll be here any second." James clenched his rifle tighter, heart racing as he prepared for the onslaught. He had just caught a glimpse of the first shadow creeping into the clearing, its form flickering in and out of focus, a grotesque imitation of reality. It moved with unnatural speed, coiling through the air like smoke. "Fall back," Leora shouted, and James instinctively shifted to the side, creating space between them as the shadow lunged. He fired at the creature, the shot ringing out in the stillness. The bullet passed through the figure, causing it to splinter like glass, shards of dark energy scattering across the clearing. But the creature didn't stop. It reformed, coiling back into a semblance of itself, undeterred. "Concentrate on one," Leora yelled, slashing her blade at the approaching figure. "Don't let them swarm us." With a grim determination, James aimed for the closest shadow and fired again. This time, the shot connected with a palpable force, the energy crackling as it slammed into the creature's core. The shadow twisted and screeched, the sound grating against James's nerves. It disintegrated, dissolving into tendrils of darkness that floated away like smoke. "Good. Keep it up," Leora encouraged, but her own blade flicked through the air, trying to keep the other figures at bay. The shadows were relentless, emerging from the depths of the forest, their shapes multiplying like roaches under a light. As James shot at another shadow, the glow beneath his skin intensified, thrumming like a heartbeat. The energy felt wild and untamed, eager to be unleashed, but he didn't know how to control it. "James, the key," Leora shouted, her voice laced with urgency. "Let it out. Tap into it." He hesitated, fear clawing at him. "What if it backfires?" "I don't know how to." "Trust it. It's part of you." The shadows lunged, closing in on them both, and James felt a surge of desperation. With a deep breath, he focused on the energy within him, willing it to respond. The power surged, a fire igniting in his veins. Suddenly, he understood. The key was a part of him, a weapon forged from his own will. As he opened himself to the flow of energy, the air around him vibrated. The shadows halted, sensing the shift, the dark tendrils recoiling as if stung. James raised his hands, and in a moment of instinct, he pushed forward, unleashing a wave of energy that erupted from the key inside him. The force collided with the shadows, a blinding pulse of light erupting from his fingertips. The shadows screamed, their forms twisting violently before disintegrating into nothingness, a scattering of dark energy dissolving into the night. James stumbled back, the recoil of the energy leaving him breathless, but he felt a rush of exhilaration. "I did it," he gasped, looking at Leora. "I actually did it." But the celebration was short-lived. More shadows poured into the clearing, larger and more aggressive than before. Their forms roiled, shifting with a chaotic hunger, and the pressure in the air thickened. "James," Leora shouted, her eyes wide. "We need to go. They'll keep coming." With renewed determination, he gripped his rifle and turned toward the path Leora had indicated earlier. "Lead the way." They dashed toward the tree line, Leora moving with a practiced speed that seemed to defy the pain in her arm. James felt the energy thrumming beneath his skin again, a powerful pulse ready to be unleashed at a moment's notice. They dashed into the woods, the shadows hot on their heels. James could hear the rustling behind them, a chorus of whispers echoing through the trees. But he pushed forward, trusting Leora to navigate them through the labyrinth of branches. "We're almost there," she called over her shoulder, her voice strained but resolute. "Just a bit further." As they plunged deeper into the forest, the shadows receded momentarily, but James could feel the pulse of energy around him. The key was aware of the danger, its presence growing more intense, more demanding. Suddenly, the forest opened into a small clearing, light by the silver glow of the moon. In the center stood a dilapidated cabin, the windows dark and lifeless, but the structure seemed to beckon them, a beacon of hope amidst the encroaching darkness. "Inside," Leora urged, and they sprinted toward the cabin, their hearts pounding in rhythm with the urgency of their flight. They burst through the door, slamming it shut behind them. The air inside was thick with dust and age, the floor creaking under their weight. James leaned against the door, breathless, trying to gather his thoughts. "Do you think they followed us?" he asked, trying to catch his breath. Leora shook her head, moving deeper into the cabin. "For now, we should be safe, but we don't have much time. They won't give up easily." James stepped further inside, glancing around at the worn furniture and peeling wallpaper. It was an eerie sanctuary, and he felt the weight of their situation pressing down on him. "What now? We can't just hide here." Leora grimaced, her hand clutching her wounded arm. "We regroup and fortify. I have some supplies stashed here. We can't rely on luck to get through this." James watched as she moved through the cabin, rummaging through cabinets and drawers, pulling out weapons and makeshift supplies. "You've been here before?" he asked, intrigued despite the circumstances. Leora nodded, glancing back at him. "This was one of my safe houses, a place to lay low when things got too hot. It's not perfect, but it'll do for now." As she continued to gather supplies, James felt the energy thrumming inside him, begging for release. He couldn't ignore it, couldn't dismiss the power that had surged through him. "What if I can use the key to create a barrier?" he suggested, thinking aloud. "Something to keep them from getting inside." Leora paused, her eyes narrowing in thought. "It might work, but it'll require focus. You have to channel the energy precisely, or it could backfire." James took a deep breath, weighing the risk. "I'll do it. We don't have a choice." With determination, he moved to the center of the cabin, envisioning the energy swirling around him, pulsing with a promise of protection. He concentrated, feeling the warmth build beneath his skin as he prepared to harness the key's power. "Just remember," Leora cautioned, her tone serious. "If you're not careful, it could tear you apart as much as it could shield us." He nodded, letting her words settle in his mind. "I'll be careful." James focused inward, drawing on the energy that resonated within him. The air thickened, shimmering with potential as he shaped it into a barrier, imagining a wall of light encasing the cabin. He could feel the strain of the power as it surged, the key vibrating with intensity. With a shout, he released the energy, pouring it into the space around him. A barrier of shimmering light erupted, encircling the cabin with a crackling force. But as the barrier solidified, a sudden wave of pain shot through him. It felt like his very essence was being stretched, pulled thin as he struggled to maintain control. Shadows lurked outside the barrier, coiling around the edges, probing for a way in. "James," Leora shouted, her voice a blend of concern and urgency. "You need to focus. Don't let it overwhelm you." He gritted his teeth, trying to regain his focus, but the energy surged chaotically, fighting against his will. It felt as if the shadows were feeding off his fear, growing bolder with every moment. "Fight it," Leora urged, her eyes locked onto his. "You have to command it." James clenched his fists, feeling the warmth of the key within him. This was his power, his responsibility. With a fierce determination, he closed his eyes, centering himself, focusing on the barrier and the energy thrumming through him. "I can do this. I can protect us." Slowly, he felt the chaos begin to settle, the energy responding to his command. The barrier flickered, stabilizing, a steady glow enveloping the cabin. Outside, the shadows howled in frustration, slamming against the barrier with relentless force. He opened his eyes, the glow around him pulsating in rhythm with the energy inside him. "It's working," he gasped, relief flooding through him. "Good," Leora said, her voice steadier now. "But we have to be ready. This won't hold them off for long." James nodded, focusing on the barrier as the shadows thrashed against it, their forms twisting in furious attempts to breach their sanctuary. The energy inside him felt alive, eager to fight, to defend, but he knew they couldn't stay trapped here forever. "Leora," he said, glancing over at her, "if we're going to make it out of this, we need a plan." She nodded, her expression resolute. "We do. I've got some intel from the safe house that could help us figure out who's after you. But we need to buy some time. If we can hold them off long enough, we might be able to find a way to turn the tide." James swallowed, his heart racing. "Then let's do it." Together, they prepared for the storm brewing outside, the shadows clawing at the barrier with renewed ferocity. But for the first time, James felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't just a pawn in their game. He was a player, and he had the power to change everything. The shadows roared against the barrier like a tempestuous sea, their whispers mingling with the wind, dark tendrils reaching and curling against the shimmering light. James felt the strain of maintaining the energy around them, a weight pressing against his chest. But he held firm, channeling every ounce of will into the barrier. "Leora," he said, his voice strained. "What do you have that can help us? We can't just wait here." Leora moved to a dusty table cluttered with old maps and equipment, rummaging through papers that had long since yellowed with age. "There's something," she replied, her brow furrowed in concentration. "When I was on the run, I discovered information about these shadows. They're not just mindless creatures, they're controlled by someone powerful." James's heart raced at her words. "Who? Do you know?" "I suspect it's the same faction that's been hunting us," she replied, glancing at him. "They've been experimenting with dark energy, manipulating it to create these creatures. They're trying to harness the chaos to exert control over the galaxy." James clenched his fists, anger flaring within him. "So this is all part of their plan, to use me as a pawn in their game?" "Yes," Leora confirmed, spreading a map across the table. "And if we don't figure out how to stop them, they'll use the key's power to unleash a nightmare across the universe. They want to take what you have and bend it to their will." The weight of her words settled over him like a dark cloud. "Then we can't let them get to me, but how do we stop it?" "There's a place, a location marked here," she said, tracing her finger over the map. "It's an old archive, a repository of knowledge hidden away from prying eyes. If we can reach it, we might find a way to sever their connection to the shadows and reclaim control over the key." James's mind raced. "But it's likely heavily guarded. How do we even get there?" Leora paused, her expression contemplative. "We'll have to create a distraction. If we can lure the shadows away from the path, we might stand a chance. Once we're on the move, I can guide us." A surge of determination coursed through James. "Then let's do it. We'll draw them out." The barrier trembled as another wave of shadows slammed against it, their presence becoming more chaotic, the whispers rising to a fever pitch. "We don't have much time," he said, urgency rising in his voice. "Right," Leora replied, gathering the supplies she had found. "I'll set up some traps around the cabin to buy us a little time. They'll expect us to hunker down, so we need to surprise them." James nodded, moving to help her. Together, they prepared a series of makeshift defenses, sharpened branches, explosive charges, anything they could find to create obstacles for the shadows. Each trap they set felt like a small act of defiance against the overwhelming darkness that threatened to consume them. As they worked, James could feel the shadows' frustration growing, the air thickening with their anger. "They know we're in here," he said, glancing at the door, feeling the intensity of their focus. "They can sense the key," Leora replied, her eyes sharp with resolve. "That's why we need to act quickly. Once they realize we're not playing their game, they'll come for us with everything they've got." With the traps in place, James positioned himself by the window, rifle at the ready. The shadows pressed closer, a mass of writhing darkness coiling around the barrier. He felt the pulse of energy inside him, urging him to act, to unleash the power he had barely begun to understand. "On my mark," Leora said, her voice steady despite the chaos outside. "We'll make a break for it as soon as the shadows are drawn away." James nodded, his heart pounding. "I'm ready." With a sudden crash, the shadows surged against the barrier, their forms contorting violently as if trying to break through. A guttural roar echoed through the cabin, the darkness swirling into a single massive shape, more monstrous than before. "Now," Leora shouted, and they dashed toward the door. As they burst out of the cabin, James unleashed a burst of energy, directing it toward the shadows in a wave of light that shattered the darkness momentarily. The shadows recoiled, screeching in fury as they tried to reform. "Keep moving," Leora urged, sprinting ahead, the path ahead shrouded in moonlight and shadows. They raced through the forest, adrenaline driving them forward as they navigated the twists and turns of the terrain. James could hear the shadows giving chase, their cries echoing behind them, but the energy within him surged with each step, urging him onward. "Over here," Leora called, veering off the main path into a dense thicket. "This way, it'll lead us to the old archive." They plunged into the underbrush, the sounds of pursuit growing louder as the shadows closed in. James risked a glance over his shoulder, catching sight of the writhing mass pursuing them. A wave of shadows surged forward, merging into a singular entity that roared with rage. "Faster!" Leora shouted, pushing through the thick foliage. "We need to reach the clearing ahead." They burst into another clearing, the moonlight bathing the area in a soft glow. James felt the shadows closing in behind them, a suffocating presence pressing against his back. "Now what?" he panted, scanning the area for any signs of a way forward. "There," Leora pointed toward a weathered structure in the distance, partially hidden by trees. "That's the archive. We just need to get inside." As they sprinted toward the building, the shadows erupted from the forest behind them, a crashing wave of darkness surging forward. James felt the key thrumming violently within him, a desperate urge to unleash its power. "James," Leora shouted, her voice barely audible over the din. "We need to get in." He felt the shadows clawing at his heels, an insatiable hunger that filled the air with dread. With one last burst of energy, James pushed forward, reaching the door of the archive. "Open," he shouted, slamming his shoulder against the heavy door. To his surprise, it creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior. He darted inside, Leora following close behind. The door slammed shut just as the shadows reached the threshold, a cacophony of screams erupting outside. Breathless, James leaned against the door, heart pounding in his chest. The room was filled with ancient relics and holographic displays, a treasure trove of forgotten knowledge. Dust motes danced in the air, light by the faint glow of control panels lining the walls. "Quick," Leora urged, scanning the room. "We need to find a way to access the archives. There must be something here to help us." James pushed himself away from the door, the shadows outside howling in frustration. The energy inside him still pulsed with urgency, begging to be released, but he had to focus. "Where do we start?" "Look for the central console," she instructed, moving toward a large circular platform at the center of the room. "It should give us access to the archive's data." James followed her, heart racing as he examined the ancient technology. The console was covered in dust, but it appeared intact. He brushed his fingers across the surface, feeling the hum of energy beneath his touch. "Can you activate it?" Leora asked, her eyes scanning the door. "I'll try," he replied, focusing on the energy flowing through him. With a deep breath, he reached for the console, channeling the key's power into the device. The moment his energy connected, The console flickered to life. Screens light the dim room. Data streamed across the displays, revealing layers of information. Ancient texts, star maps, and references to the shadows swirled in a chaotic dance. James felt a surge of excitement as he navigated through the archives. "There, that's it," Leora pointed at a section marked with a bright red alert. "Those files detail the connection between the key and the shadows. If we can understand how to sever their bond, we might be able to stop them for good." As James delved deeper into the files, a sense of urgency gripped him. The shadows outside were relentless, their cries echoing in the air. Time was running out, and they had to act quickly. He focused, pulling up the information Leora had indicated. As the text appeared on the screen, he felt a wave of understanding wash over him. This was it. The key was a part of a greater mechanism, a tool for binding or severing connections. "Leora," he said, his voice urgent. "If we can create a counterbalance to the shadow's energy, we can sever their connection. But it requires a focused release of energy from the key." Her eyes widened. "That's risky. You'd have to channel it precisely." "I know," he replied, determination hardening his resolve. "But if we don't try, we'll be overwhelmed. We have to make a stand." "Okay," Leora said, steeling herself. "We'll do this together. I'll help you channel the energy. We can't let them win." James nodded, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. Together, they began to strategize, gathering the energy of the archive around them, focusing on the connection to the shadows outside. As they prepared, the shadows continued their assault on the building, their rage palpable. James could feel the darkness pressing against the walls, clawing for entry, but he held fast to his resolve. They would not be consumed. This was their moment. The atmosphere in the archive crackled with tension as James and Leora prepared for the confrontation ahead. The shadows outside howled like a chorus of lost souls, their voices merging into a cacophony of despair and rage. Each scream sent shivers down James's spine, but he steeled himself, focusing on the task at hand. "Do you see that?" Leora pointed at a cluster of energy nodes around the console, each pulsing with faint light. "Those can help amplify the key's energy. If we can channel them right, it might give us the edge we need." James nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "We'll need to tap into that energy and synchronize it with the key's power. If we can create a surge at the right moment, it might be enough to break their hold." "Let's do it," she said, determination shining in her eyes. "We have to make it count." With a shared resolve, they moved to the nodes, fingers brushing over the cool surfaces. James could feel the energy thrumming beneath his skin, a symphony of power just waiting to be unleashed. He closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself and drawing on the connection he had forged with the key. As he opened his eyes, a bright flash lit the room, the energy nodes flaring to life in response to his focus. Leora mirrored his movements, her own energy merging with his as they synchronized their efforts. "Now," Leora shouted, directing her energy toward the console. James joined her, channeling the key's power into the nodes. A pulse of light surged through the room, flooding the archive with brilliance as the energy began to intertwine, creating a personage barrier around them. The shadows outside recoiled momentarily, but quickly regrouped, their fury igniting anew. The howling outside intensified, a dark storm that threatened to tear through the very fabric of their sanctuary. "Focus," James yelled over the cacophony, his heart racing. "We need to concentrate the energy on the threshold. That's where the shadows are strongest." Leora nodded, determination etched across her features. "On my count, 1, 2, 3. Together, they directed the combined power toward the main door, where the shadows pressed furiously against the wood. The energy swirled, forming a radiant beam that shot from the console to the threshold, light the darkness with a blinding light. As the light met the shadows, an explosion of sound erupted, the clash of light against darkness resonating like a thunderclap. The shadows writhed and twisted, their forms distorting in reaction to the onslaught. "Keep it steady," James urged, pouring every ounce of energy he could muster into the beam. We need to hold it long enough to sever their connection. The shadows screamed, a sound that seemed to pierce the very air, rising in pitch as they began to falter against the light. James could see the edges of the shadows blurring, fraying like a fabric unraveling. A surge of hope ignited within him. "Almost there," Leora shouted, sweat beading on her forehead as she strained to maintain her focus. "Just a little longer." The shadows coiled and retreated momentarily, sensing the impending threat. James could feel their fear, a palpable energy that shifted in the air. For a brief moment, the darkness lessened, and a flicker of light filled the room. "Now," James yelled, thrusting his hands forward. "Release it." With a collective effort, they unleashed the combined energy in a sweeping arc. The light burst forth, crashing into the shadows like a wave, a torrent of brilliance that lit every corner of the archive. The moment the light touched the shadows, there was a thunderous explosion. The room shook as the shadows screamed, a raw and primal sound that echoed through the night. The darkness shattered, fragments dissipating like ashes in the wind. James felt a rush of power surging through him as the connection between the key and the shadows splintered. The force of the release reverberated through the room, pushing them back against the console. But in the midst of chaos, a calm settled over him. He had felt their connection severed, and it invigorated him with a newfound strength. Leora steadied herself beside him, her breath heavy. "Did it work? Are they gone?" James peered through the remaining haze of energy, heart racing with adrenaline. "I think we did it," he said cautiously, still feeling the lingering pulse of power within him. The shadows outside had quieted, their howls replaced by a profound silence that stretched into the night. But as James looked out the window, he spotted a glimmer of movement in the darkness, a shadow taking shape, reassembling from the remnants of their defeat. "No, it's not over," he shouted, dread creeping back into his heart. "They're reforming." Leora's eyes widened. "They must have a source somewhere. We didn't sever all their connections." James's mind raced. "We have to find out where they're coming from. There must be something here, some clue about their origin." They turned back to the console, scanning through the information still displaying on the screens. Ancient texts scrolled by, detailing the history of the shadows and their connection to dark energy. As he combed through the data, a particular passage caught his eye. "Leora, look at this." James pointed at a highlighted section. "It talks about a central source, a dark nexus. If we can find it, we might be able to truly destroy the shadows." "Where is it located?" Leora asked, moving closer to read over his shoulder. "It's in a place called the Abyssal Conclave," he said, his voice steadying. "A hidden world where the dark energy originates. It's heavily guarded, but could be the key to ending this once and for all." "Then that's where we need to go," Leora said, determination radiating from her. "We have to find that nexus and cut it off at its source. But how do we get there? The map doesn't show a direct route." "We'll have to be careful," James replied, his mind racing. "The shadows will be hunting for us after that display. We need to find a way to blend into the darkness, use it to our advantage." "Let's gather what we can from the archive," Leora suggested. "There might be supplies or weapons that can help us on our journey." As they moved through the cluttered room, James felt a sense of urgency enveloping him. Time was running out, and they needed to act quickly before the shadows regrouped. He rifled through old crates and shelves, collecting anything that could be useful: a small energy generator, a map of the local region, and several vials of strange, glowing substances that hummed with energy. "Anything else?" Leora asked, her hands full with a satchel of supplies. James hesitated, scanning the room one last time. "We need a way to navigate through the darkness," he said, suddenly struck by a thought. "The old relics here, some of them might hold ancient knowledge about shadow manipulation. If we can learn how to harness it, we can use the darkness to mask our presence." "Let's search for those relics, then," Leora urged, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "If we can manipulate the shadows, we might stand a chance against them." They combed through the archive, uncovering relics from forgotten civilizations, each one pulsing with latent energy. James felt a connection to them, an understanding that these artifacts held secrets waiting to be uncovered. Finally, they stumbled upon an ancient tome, its cover adorned with intricate symbols. James opened it carefully, scanning the faded text. The pages contained spells and incantations for manipulating shadows, information that could turn the tide in their favor. "This could be it," he said, excitement building within him. "If we can learn to wield these techniques, we can become a force against the darkness." Leora peered over his shoulder, her expression shifting from excitement to concern. "But it's dangerous. We need to be careful. If we misuse this power, it could consume us." James nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. "I'll be cautious. I have to be. But this knowledge might be our only chance." With the tome secured, they gathered their supplies and prepared to leave the archive. As they stepped outside, the air felt charged with energy, a mixture of hope and apprehension. The night was still, but the shadows lurked in the periphery, waiting for their moment to strike. "Ready?" Leora asked, glancing at him. "Ready," James replied, determination hardening his resolve. They had faced darkness before, but now they had a chance to reclaim the light. With the moon high above, they set off into the night, their path uncertain, but their purpose clear. They would confront the shadows at their source, armed with knowledge and newfound power. The journey ahead would be perilous, but together they could rise above the darkness. The darkness wrapped around them like a living shroud as James and Leora navigated the twisted paths leading to the abyssal conclave. Shadows danced at the edges of their vision, whispering secrets that sent chills down their spines. Despite the palpable fear lurking in the corners of their minds, a sense of purpose drove them forward. They were no longer mere survivors. They were hunters on a quest to confront the heart of darkness itself. "We'll have to tread carefully," Leora murmured, her voice low as they entered a clearing dotted with ancient stones, remnants of a civilization long lost to time. "The shadows are likely aware of our presence." James scanned the area, heart pounding. "Let's use what we learned. If we can manipulate the shadows around us, they won't see us coming." With Leora's encouragement, he opened the ancient tome, its pages filled with swirling symbols and cryptic illustrations. He traced his fingers over a passage detailing a spell for shadow cloaking, something that could obscure their movements. "Here," he said, reading aloud the incantation. "We need to focus our energy and visualize the shadows enveloping us." Leora nodded, her eyes reflecting the determination that ignited his spirit. "On 3. 1, 2, 3. As they spoke the incantation in unison, the air thickened around them, shadows twisting and curling at their command. James felt a tingling sensation coursing through his veins as the darkness wrapped around them, forming a protective barrier that dulled their presence in the light. They moved deeper into the abyss, guided by instinct and the faint glow of distant energy sources. The shadows that lurked within the trees hesitated, their menacing forms momentarily confused by the barrier surrounding the two. "This is incredible," Leora whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. "We're actually manipulating the darkness." "Let's keep moving," James urged, his voice steady despite the thrill coursing through him. "We need to find that nexus before the shadows regroup." Navigating through the twisted underbrush and craggy rocks, they stumbled upon a network of caves. The air was thick with an unsettling energy, a palpable sense of dread emanating from within. James felt the pull of the darkness beckoning them, urging them to turn back. "It's here," he said, swallowing hard. "I can feel it. The nexus must be deep within the caves." As they approached the entrance, the shadows seemed to shift and swirl, responding to their presence. A low growl reverberated from within the depths, echoing like a warning. "Stay close," Leora said, her grip tightening on the satchel of supplies. "We need to be ready for anything." They stepped into the cave, the darkness consuming them as they ventured further into the abyss. The air grew colder, and with each step, the oppressive energy of the shadows grew stronger, pressing against their minds like a vice. James clutched the tome, its pages glowing faintly with the energy he had absorbed. "We can't let it overwhelm us," he said, a surge of determination cutting through the fear. Remember our training. We're stronger together. As they pressed onward, they discovered cavernous chambers filled with ancient relics, remnants of the dark energy that had once plagued the universe. Towering stone structures loomed overhead, etched with symbols that glimmered with a foreboding light. "There's so much power here," Leora breathed, her eyes wide. "But it feels corrupted." "It's feeding the shadows," James said, realizing the truth. "This place is a conduit for their energy. If we can disrupt it, we can weaken the shadows and gain the upper hand." They moved deeper, drawn toward the center of the cave where a pulsing light flickered. The nexus lay ahead, its glow almost hypnotic, swirling with dark energy that threatened to consume everything around it. But before they could reach it, a figure emerged from the shadows, tall, cloaked, and shrouded in darkness. The air crackled with tension, and James's heart raced as he faced this new adversary. "Foolish mortals," the figure hissed, its voice a chilling whisper that seemed to echo off the cave walls. "You dare enter the domain of the shadows." "Who are you?" James demanded, summoning his courage. "What do you want with us?" "I am the Warden of the Abyss," the figure declared, its eyes glowing like embers in the dark. "You have tread too far into forbidden ground. Your presence here will not go unpunished." "Enough of your threats," Leora shouted, stepping forward. "We're here to stop the shadows and sever their connection. We won't let you or them prevail." The warden laughed, a sound that chilled James to the bone. "You think you can defeat me? You are but children playing with forces beyond your comprehension." James felt a rush of anger at the taunt, his instincts flaring as he took a step forward. "We're not afraid of you. We have the power of the shadows on our side." With a flick of its wrist, the warden summoned the shadows, dark tendrils lashing out like whips toward them. James instinctively raised his hands, channeling the energy from the tome as he and Leora drew on the shadows around them. "Now," he shouted, directing the energy toward the warden. A beam of light erupted from their combined efforts, striking the dark figure with force. The warden staggered back, momentarily surprised, but quickly regained composure, its expression shifting from amusement to fury. "You will pay for that insolence." The cavern trembled as the warden summoned more shadows, thick tendrils reaching toward them, threatening to wrap around their bodies and pull them into the abyss. James and Leora focused their energy, creating a shield of light to repel the darkness. "Together," Leora shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos, "we can push back." With renewed determination, they stood firm, channeling every ounce of energy into the shield. The clash of light against darkness erupted in a brilliant explosion, light the cave with a dazzling array of colors. "Keep pushing," James urged, sweat trickling down his brow as they fought against the relentless tide of shadows. But as the energy surged, he could sense the warden's anger reaching a boiling point. The figure roared, unleashing a wave of dark energy that crashed against their shield, forcing them back. "Your power is nothing compared to the abyss," the warden howled, raising its hands in a final act of defiance. James's heart raced. They had to end this. "We need to reach the nexus," he shouted to Leora. "It's our only chance." With one last push, they broke free from the warden's grasp, sprinting toward the pulsing light at the center of the chamber. The shadows writhed around them, furious and desperate, but they pressed onward, their resolve unwavering. As they reached the nexus, the energy surged through them, beckoning them to channel their power into the heart of darkness. "Let's finish this," James yelled, grabbing Leora's hand. Together, they focused their energy, merging their strength with the pulsating light. In that moment, everything fell away, the shadows, the warden, the cavern. All that remained was their connection to the light and their shared purpose. With a deafening roar, they unleashed their energy into the nexus, determined to sever the dark connection once and for all. The pulse of the nexus resonated around them, an almost sentient heartbeat that thrummed through James and Leora as they channeled their combined energy. Shadows writhed at the edges of the chamber, trying to break through their defenses, but they pressed on, fueled by a desperate determination. "Focus on the light," James shouted, feeling the energy coalesce within him. We can't let the darkness consume us. The Nexus throbbed in response, a vortex of dark energy swirling with chaotic intent. As they poured their power into it, a blinding light erupted, lighting the cave and casting the warden's form in stark relief. The dark figure recoiled, its shadowy tendrils hissing and retreating from the onslaught of light. "Fools," the warden snarled, its voice echoing with a twisted mixture of rage and fear. "You think you can challenge the very essence of the abyss? You are nothing but insects in its grand design." But the light continued to grow, a radiant force that pushed back against the darkness. The Nexus trembled under their combined strength, the shadows swirling violently as if sensing their impending defeat. "Don't let up," Leora urged, her voice steady even as the shadows lashed out in retaliation. "We're almost there." James felt the energy surging within him, but he also sensed something else, a whispering presence tugging at the edges of his consciousness, luring him into the depths of despair. The shadows sought to distract him, to pull him away from the light. "No," he growled, shaking off the temptation. "I won't give in." He looked at Leora, her face set in fierce determination, and he knew they couldn't falter now. They were on the brink of breaking the darkness's grip on the universe. As the Nexus pulsated with power, they pushed harder, channeling every ounce of energy they had into the heart of darkness. The shadows writhed in a frenzy, but their combined light began to break through the veil, exposing the Nexus's core, a swirling mass of dark energy that pulsed like a heartbeat. "Together," James yelled, and they clasped hands tighter, focusing their wills. The light intensified, engulfing the chamber in a brilliance that seemed to pierce the very fabric of the abyss. The warden roared in fury, summoning shadows to envelop them. Tendrils lashed out, but they couldn't penetrate the barrier of light surrounding James and Leora. With one final push, they directed their combined energy straight into the Nexus. "Now, break it," Leora shouted, her voice resonating with power. The light surged forth, a tidal wave of brilliance that crashed into the dark core. The shadows screamed in protest, their forms disintegrating into wisps as the Nexus shattered under the weight of their resolve. The cave trembled violently, rocks crashing down as the Nexus imploded, releasing a shockwave that rippled through the abyssal conclave. James and Leora were thrown back, tumbling through the air before landing hard on the ground, disoriented but alive. As they scrambled to their feet, the warden staggered back, its form flickering and unraveling like smoke in the wind. "You cannot do this," it hissed, the anger in its voice fading into desperation. "We already have," Leora shouted defiantly, standing tall despite the chaos swirling around them. "This ends now." The darkness began to dissipate, retreating into the shadows from which it had come. The cave was filled with light, and as the remnants of the warden vanished, a profound silence enveloped them. Breathing heavily, James glanced at Leora, his heart racing. "Did we do it? Did we really end it?" She looked around, the glow of the Nexus fading, but a warm light beginning to rise in its place. "I think we did. The shadows, they're retreating." As the last remnants of the darkness faded into nothingness, James felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over him. The oppressive weight that had hung over them for so long began to lift, leaving room for hope and possibility. But before they could fully celebrate, a flicker of movement caught James's eye. From the corner of the cave, a small figure emerged, glowing faintly, a child, no older than 6, with wide, innocent eyes. "Help me," the child whispered, reaching out a small hand. "I've been lost for so long." James and Leora exchanged glances, confusion mixing with concern. "Where did you come from?" James asked, his heart aching at the sight of the frightened child. "I don't know," the child replied, tears shimmering in their eyes. "I was taken by the shadows. Please, I want to go home." Leora knelt down beside the child, her expression softening. "We're here to help you. Can you tell us how to get out of here?" The child nodded slowly, a glimmer of hope igniting in their eyes. "Follow me." As they stood, the cave began to shimmer, the shadows retreating and the air warming around them. They followed the child deeper into the caves, moving through the remnants of the darkness that had once suffocated the light. "I can feel the darkness fading," James said, a sense of purpose igniting within him. "We have to help others who are trapped here." "Yes," Leora agreed, determination rekindling in her heart. "We need to make sure no one else suffers because of this." The child led them through twisting tunnels, light by the faint glow of their energy. As they navigated the labyrinth of the abyssal conclave, James felt a renewed sense of hope. They were not just survivors anymore. They were champions of light, ready to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. At last, they reached a hidden exit, the light of the outside world spilling into the cave. As they stepped into the sunlight, the child turned to them, gratitude shining in their eyes. "Thank you," the child said softly. "You saved me." James smiled, kneeling down to meet the child's gaze. "You're safe now. We'll make sure you get home." Leora glanced back at the cave, feeling a mixture of relief and sorrow. This place held so much pain, but we've brought the light back. As they made their way toward the nearby settlement, the warmth of the sun enveloped them, a promise of a new beginning. The darkness that had once threatened to consume everything was finally broken, and they had forged a path toward hope. But in the depths of the shadows, a lingering whisper echoed. The village nestled at the edge of the forest welcomed James and Leora with wary eyes. As they stepped into the sunlight, the echoes of the abyssal conclave faded, replaced by the familiar sounds of life, children laughing, villagers chatting, and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. But beneath the surface, an undercurrent of tension hung in the air, palpable to both of them. "Will they believe us?" James asked, glancing at the child, who clung tightly to Leora's hand, their small fingers trembling. Leora looked down at the child and then back at James, determination hardening her resolve. "We have to make them understand. We can't let fear silence our voices." As they approached the village square, a group of villagers gathered, their expressions a mix of curiosity and apprehension. The leader, an older woman with silver hair and wise eyes, stepped forward. "What brings you here, travelers? And who is this child?" "We found them in the abyssal conclave," Leora explained, kneeling down to the child's level. "They were lost to the shadows. We managed to break the darkness, but we need your help to ensure others aren't trapped like they were." The woman's gaze softened as she knelt beside Leora. "Thank you for saving this child, but you speak of darkness. What do you mean?" James stepped forward, fueled by urgency. "The shadows have been growing in power, corrupting the land and ensnaring those who wander too close. We need to work together to cleanse the remaining darkness. If we don't, it will return." A murmur rippled through the villagers, skepticism mixed with hope. "How do we know you speak the truth?" one man called out, crossing his arms. "The abyssal conclave has long been a place of nightmares." "Because we faced it," Leora said, her voice steady and unwavering. "We fought against the shadows, and we broke their hold on the Nexus. But we need your strength. Together, we can drive the darkness away for good." James watched as the villagers exchanged glances, weighing their options. Fear and doubt lingered in the air, but he could see the flicker of hope igniting in their eyes. "Who will join us?" he urged, stepping forward. "We can't fight this alone. The shadows will only grow bolder if we do nothing." Finally, the leader stood tall, her voice rising above the murmur. "I believe you. I can feel the truth in your words. If you face the shadows and returned, then we must stand with you. We cannot let fear dictate our lives any longer." A ripple of agreement spread through the crowd, emboldening their spirits. One by one, villagers stepped forward, ready to confront the darkness alongside James and Leora. "Gather your tools," Leora called out, her voice filled with energy. "We need to prepare for what lies ahead. Every bit of light counts." As the villagers rallied, James felt a renewed sense of purpose swelling in his chest. They weren't just fighting for their own survival, they were igniting a flame of hope for the entire region, ready to push back against the encroaching darkness. With the sun dipping low in the sky, casting an orange hue over the village, They gathered supplies, torches, protective charms, and weapons forged from the remnants of the shadows. James stood before the assembled villagers, heart racing with anticipation. "We've faced the darkness before, and we can do it again," he declared, raising a torch high. "Tonight, we will march into the depths and reclaim what's ours. We will shine a light where shadows fear to tread." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices echoing into the twilight as they prepared to embark on their journey. Leora stood beside James, her eyes alight with determination. "Are you ready?" she asked, a smile breaking through her resolve. James nodded, adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Together, we can do this." As they set off toward the abyssal conclave once more, the villagers' spirits surged with the promise of hope. Together, they forged a path into the unknown, a united front against the shadows that had once terrorized their lives. The journey back to the cave was filled with a sense of purpose and camaraderie. As they entered the darkened expanse of the abyssal conclave, the light from their torches lit the path ahead, pushing back against the shadows that still lingered at the edges. "Stay close," James called out, glancing back to ensure everyone was safe. "We've come too far to falter now." Leora moved beside him, their energy intertwined, a beacon of hope in the growing darkness. "We will face the shadows together. We are stronger than they are." As they descended deeper into the caverns, James could feel the remnants of darkness still pulsing in the air, the echo of their previous battle resonating in his mind. But this time, they were not alone. The villagers marched with them, a testament to their resilience. Finally, they reached the chamber where the Nexus had once pulsed with dark energy. The air crackled with tension, the shadows swirling as if aware of their presence. "Form a circle," Leora commanded, her voice cutting through the unease. "We need to harness our energy together." As they formed a circle, James felt the collective strength of the villagers surrounding him, their resolve igniting the light within him. He could see the fear in their eyes, but also the determination to fight back. "Now, focus on the light," he urged, feeling the energy surging within the group. "We're here to drive the darkness away once and for all." As they concentrated, the shadows began to writhe, sensing the collective power of their resolve. The air grew heavy with tension, and James could feel the darkness pushing back against their light. "Hold strong," Leora shouted, her voice steady. "We can't let it overwhelm us." With each pulse of energy, they pushed against the shadows, their combined strength forming a barrier of light that cut through the darkness. The shadows hissed and writhed, but they were no match for the unity of the villagers. The air shimmered as their light began to consume the darkness, and with a final surge of energy, they unleashed a wave of brilliance that shattered the lingering shadows, scattering them into the depths of the abyss. As the light faded, silence enveloped the chamber. The oppressive weight of the darkness was lifted, leaving behind only the warmth of their victory. James turned to Leora, their eyes meeting in a shared moment of triumph. "We did it," he breathed, disbelief mixing with joy. "We really did it." The villagers erupted into cheers, their voices echoing in the chamber as they celebrated their victory over the shadows. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, a testament to the strength of unity and hope. But in the distance, a faint echo of laughter rang out, chilling their bones. "Did you think it would be that easy?" a voice sneered, and from the shadows stepped a figure cloaked in darkness, eyes glowing with malice. James's heart sank. "It's not over," he whispered, realizing that while they had won this battle, the war against the darkness had only just begun. The figure stepped from the shadows, exuding an aura of power that sent a chill down James's spine. It wore a cloak woven from darkness itself, the fabric shimmering as if it were alive, and its eyes glowed with a sickly, otherworldly light. "You foolish mortals," the entity hissed, its voice a serpentine whisper that slithered through the chamber. "You believe you can conquer the abyss? You are merely pawns in a game far beyond your understanding." The villagers fell silent, a wave of unease washing over them. James could see fear creeping into their eyes, and he felt the weight of their uncertainty pressing down on him. "Who are you?" he demanded, stepping forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do you want?" "I am the Warden of Shadows, the eternal guardian of this realm," it declared, raising a hand that pulsed with dark energy. "And you have only succeeded in awakening my wrath." James's breath quickened as he glanced back at Leora, who stood resolute by his side. "We faced your shadows and won. You can be defeated." The warden chuckled, a sound like breaking glass. "You misunderstand. The shadows are but an extension of my will. They are a mere reflection of the darkness within you, and I am their master." The words cut deep, a painful truth that resonated within him. The shadows they had battled, the darkness that had threatened to consume them, it wasn't just a force of nature. It was a manifestation of fear, despair, and every doubt they had ever felt. "But we overcame that darkness," Leora shouted defiantly. "We fought against the shadows of doubt and fear, and we emerged stronger." "Strength?" the warden scoffed, a mirthless grin stretching across its face. "Strength is nothing without understanding. You think this victory is yours? You merely delayed the inevitable." "No!" James shouted, the fire of determination igniting within him. "We won't let you twist our victory into defeat. We know what we're fighting for." "Fighting for? What do you hope to accomplish?" the warden mocked, taking a step closer. The shadows swirled around it like a storm, dark tendrils reaching out, testing the resolve of the villagers. James felt the fear creep back in, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the warmth of the villagers beside him. "We're fighting for our home, for the people we love. We've faced our darkness and found our strength in each other." Leora stepped forward, her voice steady and clear. "Together, we are more powerful than you could ever understand. You may have control over the shadows, but you don't have control over hope." The warden's laughter echoed through the cavern, an unsettling sound that reverberated off the walls. "Hope, such a fragile thing, easily crushed. Let me show you what true darkness looks like." With a flick of its wrist, the warden summoned a wave of shadows that surged toward them, an overwhelming tide intent on swallowing them whole. "Form a barrier," James shouted, urgency flooding his veins. "Protect each other." The villagers quickly rallied, forming a tight circle around Leora and James. They raised their torches and protective charms, their faces resolute as they focused on the light they had harnessed together. "Push back," Leora urged, her voice rising above the roar of the darkness. "We are not afraid." James closed his eyes, feeling the energy flowing through the circle. He could sense the fear lurking beneath the surface, but it was met with an unwavering determination. He drew on that strength, channeling it into the light, feeding it with their collective will. "Together," he called out, feeling the surge of energy coalesce around them. The shadows collided with their barrier, a cacophony of sound and fury that shook the ground beneath them. The air crackled with tension as the villagers held firm, their spirits unyielding. "Do you really think you can resist me?" the warden sneered, its voice dripping with disdain. "Your light is but a flicker against the vastness of the abyss." But as James looked around, he saw the light shining brighter than ever, light the cave with a warm glow that pierced through the darkness. He felt the connection to the villagers, their hopes and dreams intertwining with his own, forming an unbreakable bond. "Now," he shouted, and together they unleashed a surge of energy, their collective light erupting forward like a tidal wave. The darkness recoiled, hissing and writhing as their light pushed back against it, light the cavern with a brilliance that shattered the shadows. The warden staggered, eyes wide with disbelief as the light enveloped it, breaking through the veil of darkness that had once seemed invincible. "No, this cannot be," the warden screamed, the shadows spiraling away as it struggled against the onslaught of light. "Face it," Leora cried, her voice resonating with power. "You are nothing without fear. We choose to be brave, to face the darkness together." The light surged forth, engulfing the warden in a blinding brilliance. It howled in fury, a sound that echoed through the chamber as the shadows dissipated into nothingness, leaving behind only the warmth of their victory. As the last remnants of darkness faded away, a profound silence fell over the cavern. The villagers stood together, breathless and awestruck, their faces light by the fading light. "We did it," James breathed, feeling a mixture of disbelief and exhilaration wash over him. Leora smiled, a glimmer of triumph shining in her eyes. "We faced the darkness and emerged victorious." But before they could fully embrace their victory, a soft glow began to fill the chamber, a warm light that pulsed with energy. It spread outwards, light every corner of the cavern and banishing the shadows that had once claimed it. "What is happening?" one of the villagers asked, looking around in wonder. James felt a sense of calm wash over him as the light enveloped them, filling him with a warmth that soothed the lingering fears. I think we're healing it," he said, a smile breaking across his face. The cave, once a bastion of despair, began to transform. The walls shimmered with vibrant colors, the darkness replaced by a kaleidoscope of light that danced around them. Flowers bloomed in the cracks of the stone, and the air filled with the sweet scent of renewal. Leora gasped, her eyes wide as she took in the transformation. "It's beautiful." "Yes," James agreed, looking around in awe. "We didn't just defeat the darkness, we're bringing the light back to this place." As the villagers cheered, their voices echoing through the transformed cave, James felt a sense of hope swell within him. They had fought against the darkness and won, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever been touched by it. "Let's take this light back to our village," Leora suggested, her voice filled with excitement. "We can show everyone what we've accomplished together." James nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "Yes, we can rebuild, create a future free from the shadows." As they made their way out of the cave, the warm glow continued to guide them, light the path ahead. The villagers moved as one, their hearts lightened by the shared victory, ready to embrace the dawn of a new era. When they emerged into the daylight, the sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the land. The village awaited them, a gathering of familiar faces filled with hope and anticipation. As they approached, the villagers erupted into cheers, their voices ringing with joy. "You did it! You faced the darkness and returned." James felt a swell of pride as he held Leora's hand, the warmth of their connection grounding him. "Together, we all did it," he replied, looking out at the faces before him. The leader of the village stepped forward, her eyes shining with gratitude. "You have given us hope when we needed it most. Your courage has inspired us all." Leora beamed, her heart swelling with warmth. "This is just the beginning. Together, we can build a future free from fear." As the villagers celebrated, James felt a profound sense of belonging wash over him. They had faced their darkness and emerged stronger, ready to reclaim their lives. The shadows had been defeated, but the journey ahead was still filled with promise. "Let's plant a garden," Leora suggested, her eyes sparkling. "A place of light and growth, where everyone can come together." "Yes," James agreed, excitement bubbling within him. "A symbol of our victory." As the villagers began to gather seeds and tools, laughter filled the air, a beautiful symphony of hope. They worked together, planting flowers and herbs, each seed a promise of renewal. Days turned into weeks as they tended to their garden, watching it flourish under the warm sun. The village thrived, the laughter of children echoing through the streets, a reminder of the light they had brought back into their lives. Yet, even as they celebrated their victory, James couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows would always linger at the edges, waiting for the moment to strike again. He glanced at Leora, who stood beside him, her determination unwavering. "We must remain vigilant," he said quietly. "The darkness may return." Leora nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "But we've faced it once. We can face it again." As the sun set on the horizon, casting a warm glow over the village, James felt a surge of hope swell within him. They had conquered their fears, faced the darkness, and emerged victorious. "Together," he whispered, intertwining his fingers with Leora's. "Always together." And as the stars began to twinkle overhead, light the night sky, James knew that no matter what lay ahead, they would face it side by side, their hearts forever intertwined, ready to shine a light against the darkness.